People tend to remember things in a way that makes them look better. Most of the time when people say, I really remember, I'm super confident and I vividly remember it, they're getting the gist of it right. But many of the details might not be right. So that's where some of the errors can creep in.
Well, our next guest is the memory doc. His name is Dr Charan Ranganath, and he is an expert on this subject.
When it comes to fear and anxiety, there's different kinds of learning that take place. And one part of the learning is a part that's very separate from the memory for what happened.
What can you teach me about how I can teach myself to create better structure around my memories?
One tip I like to give people is to do what's called planting cues. So let's say if you have to remember to do something in the future, what you can do is you can take something that is going to be available in the environment as a reminder. Imagine doing something in the future where you see that cue and then it pulls up the memory for you. That's one thing. Another thing that I talk about in the book is
This episode is proudly sponsored by Allsop & Allsop Mortgage Brokers, the leaders in Dubai real estate. Whether you're a first-time buyer, a seasoned investor, or looking to refinance, Allsop & Allsop's dedicated mortgage team will expertly guide you every step of the way, ensuring a seamless and stress-free journey. Now, with over 16 years of experience, they offer exclusive access to the UAE's best rates, personalized advice, and tailored financing solutions that perfectly suit your needs, leaving you free to focus on finding your dream home. And that's what we want. Experience the difference with Allsop & Allsop, your trusted partner in securing the perfect mortgage solution.
Charan, thank you so much for coming to join us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You're here in Dubai for the first time at the Festival of Literature. What's your first impressions?
It's really exciting. I see myself as a scientist who wrote a book, and to be around a bunch of people who writing is their craft and their art, it's just been phenomenal to me. You know, crime writers, graphic novelists, cookbook authors. It's just phenomenal.
Talk to me about writing books before we get into your subject matter in particular. I wrote a book and it was painful.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm honest with you, it wasn't, it was a good idea when someone suggested it. And then embarking on the journey was tough, tough for me. I'm obviously glad when I got it done. What was it like when you wrote your first book?
Well, I can totally relate to what you're talking about. So I always knew I wanted to write a book about my field, but I just never really had I never felt like I was ready. And then I was approached by a book agent during COVID or right before COVID, I should say. And I said to her, I'm not ready to write a book. And they initially said they wanted me to write a self-help book. And I said, I have no interest in telling people what to do with their lives, but I can tell them about how memory really works and how, kind of reframe how people think of themselves. And so they really got excited about it, helped me develop the proposal. And it was interesting because a lot of people I know who write science books, they kind of write it like they would if they were lecturing for a class. And I did that. And I thought I could teach really well. I should be able to write a book. And I really got kicked by the people who were helping me. And it was really just kind of demoralizing in a way. But I realized something along the way, which was it was enormously arrogant to think that I could come into the world of writing for the public, and storytelling and just come in and just do it, right? I mean, there's people who work their whole lives learning to tell stories. And so for me to come in and I had an idea. The analogy I like to give is that in academic writing, even if it's for a general audience, you're thinking about what am I allowed to say? What can I get away with saying that's not going to be inaccurate in any way, shape, or form and very precise? And so it's kind of like being a classical musician, right? It's like you come in, you think you know everything about music, and then all of a sudden you're thrown in with Miles Davis and figure out what to do, and you realize it's a completely different thing. And so I had to learn an entirely new craft, which was both the hardest thing I've done career-wise, and it was one of the most rewarding experiences, but it was an emotional roller coaster. I had times where I thought, I'm just going to quit. This isn't going to work out. And I had times where I was just like going into this zone of hyper-focus and just typing away. And and then by the time I got done, it was like those scenes of a marathon where the person just falls across the finish line.
I had Lord Jeffrey Archer here, one of the most successful authors in the world last year, and he told me about how he writes books. Now he's 82 years old, and every book, the first manuscript, he writes by hand.
Oh, wow, really?
And he gets up every morning and he lives on the River Thames, and he has his desk by the window, and early in the morning, 6:30, he starts his writing. And when he writes, he says, I have to write it by hand at first. It's the way that it's cathartic to me and all that kind of stuff. And it was fascinating going on the journey of learning, because his first book was a terrible failure. He was obviously a failed politician, and then a terrible failure with his first book, and his wife said, give it up,
Wow.
But then the second book, Cain and Abel, was written, and before you know it, it's a global success. And I think there's 750 million copies of his books have been sold around the world. And so it's just this colossal success story.
That's amazing.
But I love the fact that someone still to this day will sit down with a notepad and a pen and a fountain pen and write. And these books aren't small, they're big books.
Yeah.
So when I think about books and I think about how people go into it, to me, it's like, what sucks me into a book? And 9 times out of 10, it's the story, what the story, whatever the subject matter may be. Bring me in, by getting me to connect with the why rather than the subject matter.
Yeah.
And you obviously identify with that.
Oh, absolutely. It was interesting because there's different ways you can go about explaining the brain to people, but technical is not one of them. So, especially because I think a lot of people, they like to hear brain words, but sometimes they want the psychology first and really to understand how is this relevant, like you said. And so it was a really fine balance to walk, and I didn't want to be, all respect, tons of respect for Oliver Sacks, but I don't like that approach of here's a patient who's you got brain damage. Isn't this fascinating? It's I've seen patients with brain damage and tested them and so forth and worked with them, and just don't feel like that's not me, and it's not me to want to write Shakespearean prose or anything like that. Show all the big words. I know I did work in some cute words, so. But, it was going to be me because I thought this might be the first and last book I write. And so I wanted to be able to make no compromises other than being able to make it as accessible as possible. But I wanted to do it my way. And so to tell that story, I ended up having to tell my story, which initially I thought, who the hell cares about the random guy who they've never heard of? They can't even pronounce my name, right? Are they going to care about my story? And so it was really difficult to tell that stuff, but it became part memoir, part science book, part weird stories from history. And it was just a lot of fun. And it was interesting being able to tell my stories in a way that could bring people in, and it changed some of my memories about my life throughout the process, because the act of storytelling, I mean, you probably have this experience in your own life. I talk about this in chapter 10 of my book. It changes the way you remember, because just the act of trying to communicate my memory to you changes the way that I think about it, because I have to just explain it to you in a way that I feel like you can understand. But when we have memories in our head and we just keep them to ourselves, we're just stuck in our own heads, right? So that act of sharing transforms the memory.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because that's something that intrigues me. I have memories of my childhood, and those memories that I have are vivid and clear, and some good and some bad, but they exist. And some of those memories of my childhood shaped enormously my business success that I had along the way. However, and I'll give you the example. I was bullied quite badly at school. And those people that bullied me at school created a drive in me to want to prove them wrong. Okay. And the way that I tell the story about how I was bullied is very fierce almost, because it created a lot of pain for me.
Yeah.
Well, I met one of the bullies.
Oh, yeah.
20 years later. And that one of those bullies had been such a motivation for me. And I explained that to them, and they were like, what are you talking about? They're like, that's not what happened. And what do you mean that's not what happened? We didn't do that, or I didn't do that. And for me, it was like, well, no. I know exactly what happened. It's very clear in my mind.
Yeah.
And so I then looked back to when I was a child, and I saw a time as a youngster, 3 or 4 years old, when something happened in my family, and I remember it very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody else in my family remembers it. And because we hadn't sat and discussed our different versions of the events of 50 years ago, whatever it may be, it wasn't until we did that other perspectives came out. And it maybe where it might have been really extreme to one degree, then became actually, oh, well, maybe not so bad.
Yeah.
So when I look at that and then I try and understand those stories that I've created in my own mind about what happened at a certain point in my life, and then someone either challenges it or brings another perspective to it, it literally takes the wind out of the sails almost.
Yeah.
And now I worry, because that pain from the bullying that caused the drive to become successful in business, maybe if that wasn't there, maybe a whole different journey would have taken place.
Yeah.
So as I say stuff like this to you, what do you make of that?
Oh, I mean, this is it touches on a lot of relevant points, actually. I mean, one is just the nature of our memories. That is that we have, when we remember, we don't really replay past events. We don't read it out of a book. It's not like pushing play on your, video device or whatever. You are getting little bits, fragments of the memory, how you felt, maybe a little bit of what it looked like, or the smells, or the places at best. And then you're imagining how the past could have been. And when we imagine, we often fill in blanks with our beliefs, So probably you had some reason to feel that you were bullied, and maybe the particular people you displaced that onto, or maybe the particular times that it happened didn't really fit. But often what happens is when we imagine the past, sometimes we can get the whole story wrong, even if we get many of the bits and bobs right. So a great example of this is the newscaster Brian Williams that I talked about in my book. And so Williams had this experience of going to Iraq, and he was in a helicopter, and the helicopter in front of him got shot down. And so he actually accurately remembered this story when he was talking to the media after he got back. But it was clearly a harrowing experience for him. They got stuck in the desert for a while, had to be picked up. But later on, as he started to tell his story, it morphed into a story of how his helicopter went down.
Yeah.
And it became much more of a heroic tale. And eventually some veterans heard this and they got very mad. They said, "You're taking our story and trying to claim it. That's not what happened to you." And so he ended up becoming disgraced and eventually left he was one of the most prominent newscasters in America. And he ended up eventually just leaving. And because if you're a journalist, your job is to tell the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people said, well, he was lying. And to me, this is just a classic example of having 90% of the elements correct in your memory and putting it together in a very importantly, tragically incorrect narrative. But that's what we do sometimes,
But does that mean that we can never, ever trust someone's version of events for sure?
I think we can to some extent. So here's the thing. People will reimagine the past, and they will often, actually, let me put two parts of this. So sometimes when we look at our past, we can be inaccurate, but most of the time we get the most important bits right. So for instance, in your story, it is important that that friend didn't bully you, although we don't know, he might not be remembering it correctly, right?
Yes.
So and that's quite likely because people tend to remember things in a way that makes them look better. We filter it through the prism of our own beliefs and experiences. And likewise, memory is the prism through which we view the world. So it's this kind of interchange between the two. So most of the time when people say, I really remember, I'm super confident and I vividly remember it, they're getting the gist of it right. but many of the details might not be right. And so that's where some of the errors can creep in. Now, the two things that I think are very relevant are, one is perspective is very important. I think we tend to think of memories as if it should be an objective view of the world. But there's great lab experiments where people are told a story, let's say, and they're asked to remember it from a particular character's perspective. And then you say, okay, well, now tell it to me from this other character's perspective. And they remember all these bits and pieces that they couldn't remember before because they changed their point of view. Now think of our lives, right? Sorry about that. Think of our lives where you have these experiences where, let's say you had a bad relationship, right? Really bad breakup, and let's say the person cheated on you. I'm just making this up, but let's say the person cheated on you.
How do you know my story?
You were the one who's misbehaving. I don't know. Why did you put that on me all of a sudden? So, something like that happens. And when people look back, they remember the relationship very, very negatively, right? Then a bunch of years go by and you realize, oh, I dodged a bullet with that one. And you get into a new relationship and everything's good. And you can look back at that same relationship and remember all these bits that were really positive. And nothing's changed about your experiences. And you've got all those bits in memory somewhere. But the perspective with which you view them is both a spotlight on the particular memories that you can pull up.
Right.
And it also is kind of a narrative that you use to shape the different memories that you construct about the past. So perspective is very important too. And then the third thing is the act of remembering changes memory. So sometimes what happens is initially when we remember something, we remember it quite accurately, like in the Brian Williams case. But as you start to tell the story more and more, the memory becomes imbued with the residue of every other time that you remembered it. And so maybe you're telling the story again and you seem a little more heroic and less afraid.
Is that like the almost like the I tell you a story, you tell somebody else, you tell that person, and that story changes over the course of 5 people sharing that piece of information. Is it much like that, but it's internal as opposed to external?
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Now it's not inevitable that you'll be inaccurate. I mean, many people can be consistent, but they still converge on certain parts of the narrative and lose a lot of those details. But what can happen is you can incorporate misinformation. And there's people who've been wrongfully incarcerated because an eyewitness was questioned over and over and over, and details were suggested by law enforcement. And then what happened was the witness created this whole memory for something that was, in some sense, accurate. It reflected information that they had heard from the policeman who's interrogating them. And they mistakenly made a story that was about their own memory. And as they remembered it, as they were asked to remember, initially there's nothing. But then they remember something, but they mistake what was fed to them with the information of what the experience actually was. And then that information comes in. And you can see these things in lineups of perspective, like suspects.
Yeah.
So somebody might look at a lineup and say, I don't know, I don't remember any of these people, but this one seems kind of familiar. I don't know, maybe it was this one. So then the cop might say, hey, that's the one we were looking at. So then they do a lineup again. And now the person's like, I'm sure I've seen that suspect before. I'm sure they were at the scene of the crime, but they've seen them from the previous lineup, right? Mm-hmm. So just the act of even trying to remember something can result in a memory that can be confused with something that you actually experience. Does that make sense?
Well, we had a guest on the show that was on death row for 20 years for a crime he didn't commit because of that.
Yeah.
And it was DNA evidence eventually that set him free. And then he pleaded his innocence all the way through.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that almost as identical as you described that situation happened. He was picked out. Someone said, yeah, I think it's him. Mm-hmm. They then said him. He was then jailed and committed for the rape and murder of a person that he'd never even met.
Yeah. Yeah. And annals of justice are filled with stories like this.
Yeah.
And that I want to be clear, eyewitnesses aren't necessarily inaccurate. if somebody comes in and they say, here's lineup, and you go, that was definitely the person, they're usually accurate. But it's that first time they're being asked when they're fresh that they're most likely to be accurate. And after that, then it becomes contaminated. And they have to be sure. If they're just saying, I kind of remember it, that's, you've got to like disregard it at that point.
It's like that conversation where I say to you, this happened, and you say to me, no, it didn't. And I say to you, I bet you $10 it did. And you look at me and you think for a minute, no, I know that. And you go, no, I bet you $100, Spencer, that didn't. And I go, I bet you my house. And it's me with the most certainty then that creates doubt in your mind that what you've interpreted or believed to be true.
This is a very high stakes gambling situation.
But isn't it?
But isn't it? So I imagine a Dubai casino.
We haven't got one yet. Then maybe when we get one. But it's like, you know, I've been in conversations before where somebody said this has happened, and I'm like, no, it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally have gone, no.
Yeah.
They're like, on my children's life, I'm telling you, that didn't happen. Could have done. Let's move it on to the area that really interests me is around depression.
Yeah.
Because I was clinically depressed around 2013 to 2016. And I was pushed forward to take medication, which I never did, thankfully. But that really fascinates me because people that are depressed, then obviously we have high rates of suicide, but people that are depressed go through enormous torture and pain.
Yeah.
And you have an element of the community or the population that will say, come on, let's the old fashioned way, you know, let's snap out of it and try and work towards something more positive. Yeah, that stuff. And then the people that I think almost go to the nth degree and allow people to talk it through and just repeat and repeat because they need someone to hear them.
Yeah.
Okay. And it doesn't progress anywhere anyway. I look at those stories that I was creating in my own mind throughout that depression.
Yeah.
And I was clear. There wasn't any ambiguity. I didn't doubt anything about how I felt. I was very clear on why suicide was the best thing to do. I'd convinced myself that I was of no use to society. I was, you know, that's my story. You know, I wasn't sad.
Yeah.
It was just, I'm in the way.
Yeah.
You know, if I remove myself from this situation, then everything's going to be better.
Yeah.
And so it begs the question around memory and then how that impacts that. So what learnings do you have around there? What has it taught you? And what can you help us understand more about that?
Well, actually, this was in some sense my entry point into memory research. So I started off in grad school doing depression research. And we were actually studying people who didn't have depression, or some people did. I actually diagnosed some who did and some who didn't. But one of the things that happened was we would try to get them in a sad mood and look at how it changed their thinking. And the best way to do that was to ask them to think of a sad moment in their lives. Even people who came in completely cheerful, within a couple of minutes of thinking about a sad moment in their life and bringing it to mind, would just become completely morose. You know, and sometimes, I mean, we always got people back on their feet before they left, didn't they? So we can send them out of the real sad moment. Hey, bye. Okay, it's a little awkward here. When did you get out? No, it wasn't like that, of course. Each fraternity house. Guess what happened today, guys? Okay, so we did, but it was just so striking to me how thinking of a time in your life when you were down changed your outlook in the present about who you are and what the world is like around you, right? And so this is a very powerful concept in memory research called context, essentially. It's our mindset that we have. And what happens is when we're recalling negative events, it changes our mindset. We get sad, we get pessimistic. And one of the cardinal symptoms of depression is rumination, right? And rumination is chewing over past experiences and just reprocessing over and over, regurgitating these, things where people did you wrong or things of guilt, shame, and so forth. And what happens is that when you remember something in your life, or when you are feeling bad, you're going to be more likely to remember things that are consistent with how you feel. Mm-hmm. That is, it's like your mood, your mental context is a spotlight that can shine on certain memories, and, everything else gets kind of lost in the shadows.
Yeah.
So if you're in a negative mood, you will pull up memories that are consistent with that mood, and you will remember those in the most negative way possible, because, essentially every memory that you can come up with, there's ways that you can spin it that make it more negative or less negative. So then when you remember something negative, well, how do you feel? You feel worse. And when you feel worse, what happens? You remember even more negative things that are consistent with the mood. And so it becomes this vicious cycle of remembering, ruminating, and then feeling worse as a result. And so depression, I conceive of it as partly a memory disorder, really. And I guess, anxiety, which is the flip side, many people, it's highly comorbid. Anxiety, if you think about memory in depression, it's very past looking, and anxiety, it's very forward looking. You anticipate threats, you anticipate the worst, because you remember things that did go wrong, or you remember them, through this really twisted way that they went wrong, more wrong than they really did. And I think this highlights the fact that memory isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's using the past to kind of give us a sense of what's going on here and now, and where things are going to lead, and how can we plan for the future. And unfortunately, in depression and anxiety disorders, it runs off the rails, that whole process. But in many situations, if you look at people who aren't prone to depression, they often remember the past in a more rosy way and accentuate the positive parts of their experiences and view the future in a more positive way than perhaps it might turn out, actually.
Has society, because I don't want to say who, so I don't know who, but it seems to me then the youth of today seem to be fed more dig into the dark times of your past type of narrative when thinking about that. And then they, the word trauma comes up, doesn't it? I've had a trauma from when I was young. Sometimes you talk to people. I had a really loving family, and I went to school. I was I was an A-star student. However, and they want to then dwell on that rather than the fact that they had an awesome set of parents, and dad was at every hockey match or football match or whatever it may be, and mum was a great cook, and they had a great. They don't focus on that. So for me, it's like I look at younger people, and it's like, you're young, okay, let's try and find a time when you've got a trauma, and let's dig that trauma up, and then let's talk about that trauma. And like you said about the people that you worked with that you made them feel sad, that's almost doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Is that good therapy?
Well, so I can't comment on whether young people are different than we were when we were younger, but what I'll say is that there's an idea in some schools of insight-oriented therapy that if you uncover the trauma and if you process it, that essentially you will kind of get better, essentially, that insight alone will fix things. And what you find often is that there's two things that you can fall into. One is that if you basically fixate on the trauma and you retell the same narrative over and over and over again, that can make things worse as opposed to better, right? The key point in therapy is for people to be able to talk about their traumas and to have somebody else be able to reflect it back to them in a different way, from a different perspective that's a little bit more outside, to be able to say, well, here's another way you can think of it. And I think your example about being bullied as a child was a great one, because you said, well, I survived it and it gave me the drive to do these great things that I've accomplished, right? And I never, ever, ever want to minimize people's trauma. I've talked to people where it's like, they say, how can I forget? And when they tell me that, you can look in their eyes and this isn't just kind of somebody complaining. This is somebody who's really experienced things. But you can really grow and get some degree of closure from being with other people who've had similar experiences and being able to see their experiences from the outside. And then they reflect their perspective to you. And once you get that out of your head and you can see things differently, you can take stories of trauma and make them into stories of survival, make them into learning experiences and so forth. And that's where that's the power of therapy. That's the power of being able to have somebody who's listening, who cares, but is also not you. They're not stuck in your mind, right? And so that's a really important thing, is not to get trapped into the idea of just regurgitating trauma. And I think another part of it is insight alone doesn't necessarily change how things work in the real world. So, for instance, sometimes what happens is people engage in therapy and they process the trauma in some ways with the therapist, but then they go in the outside world and everything that happened in the context of therapy doesn't transfer to the real world because they're in a different context. They're pulling up different memories, essentially. And so this is where cognitive behavior therapy is very important.
Yeah.
Because the behavior therapy part involves giving people homework to do things in the real world, And so I had one of my first patients was somebody who had a driving phobia. And so what I would have him do was basically drive just through a parking lot an empty parking lot in circles, just forever, until it goes from being terrifying but tolerable to being boring. Then what you do is you have them go to a different place and they get on the freeway for one exit and then they get off or something like that. And you gradually build up their experience, essentially taking on the anxiety and watching it dissipate, and then increasing people's capabilities more and more in different contexts. And so the brain starts to generalize and learn that many, many different contexts are safe. And that's pretty crucial.
Okay, so I've seen that in a slightly different way. So I have a guy called Rob that works with me, and Rob was turned 50 this year. Very cautious guy, very sensible, very stable, cautious guy. And he was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's this year.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And was struggling to walk because of some issues that he had. And so for his 50th birthday, I said, I'm going to take you out for the day and I'm going to surprise you, so just be prepared. And I took him skydiving.
Oh, wow.
And he didn't know until the day before, and I forgot the day before, he got an email from Skydive Dubai saying, see you at the drop zone at 8:30 tomorrow morning. He came running over from his office to mine going, what are you doing? And I'm like, we're going skydiving.
Yeah.
So you see this guy that, like, when anybody goes and skydives for the first time, it's quite terrifying, the thought of it. There's lots of anxiety, there's lots of fear and that kind of stuff. But once you get in the plane, you're not going anywhere, okay? Because you're going to be jumping out of it at some point in the next 15 minutes. And so once you're on the plane, you can't do much about it. But I've taken people, so long story short, took him up there, terrified, got up in the air, strapped to the guy, jumped out the plane, landed. And then this new human was born.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
This 50-year-old man became, the conversation was, as soon as he landed, can I do it again? That was the first thing. And then what happened a week later is he said, I've been looking online about a skydiving course. Now, this is Mr. Cautious.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And he looks different. He behaves different. He's like, bring it. If you want to challenge him. Whereas before it was like, yeah, you're all right, thanks. And when I see this type of reaction, I then say to myself, is that how you get people to really shift? You spoke about the driving the car, phobia for driving cars, starts to get used to it, starts to get moderate, then starts to get boring. So it's kind of like an elongated version of that change.
Yeah.
A slower paced version of a skydive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't jump out of a plane to start with that's in the air. You jump out of one that's on the ground.
Yeah.
My wife broke her knee when she was young. She slipped on some ice. And since that day, she's never been able to do anything that's remotely anywhere close to ice, snow, winter stuff. She won't go on a pair of skis. She's terrified, blah, blah, blah. Next Saturday, there's a firewalk here. And I'm taking you on a firewalk.
Oh, wow.
And she doesn't want to go. Absolutely doesn't want to go. And so I showed her some videos last night. I said, we're going next Saturday night. It's at 5 p.m. We're going to be there for 4 hours. You're doing a firewalk. And I said, you must do this firewalk, not for me, but for you, to stop you being stuck in this way of thinking. This memory that you have and this fear that you've created from that experience you have has paralyzed you from living a full life.
Mm-hmm.
When I say these things to you and give you these types of examples, I'm saying them because I'm almost looking for you to say, yes, that's one way of shifting how people can use their memory or create new stories to create new memories, but in a very kind of like a dynamic and punchy way.
Yeah. So I say yes, and I also say no with respect. So maybe I give you some polite amendments.
I let it out. My wife can't hear the no. No joke.
Yeah. I mean, I think your story rings true, in terms of how these experiences where you confront different fears in an intense way can be transformational for people, both in terms of their fear of whatever it specifically is, but also their life narrative. But I also think it's very important to remember that part of when it comes to fear and anxiety, there's different kinds of learning that take place. And one part of the learning is a part that's very separate from the memory for what happened, right? So your wife had this experience was breaking her leg?
Broke her knee.
Broke her knee. Okay. So she breaks her knee, right? And so she remembers what happened, but separate or related, but separate from that, her brain is processing that she experienced this threat in this particular context. And that response, the visceral response, your heart rate going up, your cortisol levels, your eyes are dilating and so forth, is separate from the actual memory of what happened. And so the problem is that somebody can know that whatever happened is irrelevant to the present, but their brain is still driving this threat response that makes them feel like they are in active danger and must escape or must freeze or do something to avoid the threat. And so when you look at people with post-traumatic stress disorder, that threat, that feeling of being, essentially in danger or, in crisis comes back to them in many, many different contexts. And the problem is that the more context that comes up in, like, let's say I remember this traumatic experience. I used to work with Vietnam War vets when I was doing my internship, and the Vietnam War vets would, for things that we would think are not even relevant, like a Harley Davidson goes by or there's like fireworks on the 4th of July, they would immediately feel like they were back in Vietnam. The whole mental context shifts. They're like sweating and hearts racing and they're terrified and they can't escape because there's nothing to escape from, right? So what happens now is they've built a new threat memory for a new context. And every time this traumatic memory pops up in new places, well, now it generalizes more and more and more. And so people will now have threats that are generalized not only to, let's say, being on the ice, to being skiing, to anything that's dangerous, really, right?
Yeah.
And so the thing is that you can cognitively process this stuff and say, hey, I know this isn't relevant. I know this isn't rational, but that more basic survival response that your brain is generating is learned to be associated with certain kinds of contexts has to be really pulled out by literally pushing through the stress response. That is, if you go into the skydiving situation, you go into, let's say you have her stand on the ice, right? If initially the threat response is going through the roof, but what happens at some point is your brain's figuring out, okay, nothing's happening, and it just shuts it down. Now there's a learning process that takes place, and the learning process is, in this context, I realize now, this is not a conscious thing necessarily, but in this context, I now realize that I'm in fact safe. And that feeling of utter panic becomes one of utter relief. And in fact, some kind of it becomes empowering for some people, right? Euphoria sometimes. Yeah. But it's all driven by this kind of almost, it can be an unconscious learning. Even people with severe memory disorders, can have that kind of learning, both learning to be afraid of things and have that visceral threat response, and also learning to suppress those fear responses. And that's super important. And one of the interesting things is that when people do these kinds of experiences, though, they literally they're not unlearning the fear memory, but they're learning that the fear memory can be suppressed in certain contexts. Your brain is learning, okay, here we go. We don't need to generate this response, but the memory for the threat is still there because our brains evolved to keep us safe. And so at the end of the day, if you're a cave person and you don't go in the ice, it's not the end of the world, unless you live in an icy tundra all the time, right? So it's better to be safe than sorry from an evolutionary sense. And so some people's brains just do that more than others, But one of the interesting things that we're seeing now is, and I don't know how this is going, the science is very controversial, but psychedelics are becoming very, getting a lot of attention for being able to help process trauma, like MDMA, for instance. And one of the fascinating things about psychedelics is they induce a massive state of brain plasticity. And they also change your whole way of processing things so that you view things from a different perspective. And so, one of the hypotheses that I like, but, we don't know if it's true, is that if you process a trauma while you're in this state where you're outside of your normal self and outside of your normal perspective, and you have this massive state of brain plasticity, it's not a matter of learning to suppress this memory, but really transform the memory and revise it in really important ways. And I think that may be the power of why psychedelic therapy has been so effective for certain people.
When you take psychedelics and you have that kind of out-of-body experience with psychedelics, or almost arguably a helicopter view, to me it's like then if I'm hearing somebody else who's had the same trauma as me in their words and seeing it, it's almost exactly the same as that, because it's not your trauma when you have an out of body. It's yes, it's you, but it's not you're looking at your trauma in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of it. I do. I think that's part of it is you really need to look at it from a different perspective, and having the plasticity then allows the memory to be changed fundamentally while you're viewing it from the outside perspective.
So the plasticity means, so just to keep this in simple language, plasticity means we're able to mold or reshape or rewire the thought process that was involved before. Is that what
yeah, it's basically a blanket term for changes in the connectivity between, in neural networks. So in other words, you have a whole network of neurons, and
so people are coming, hold on a minute. So people that go through that, they're coming out of that experience saying, I've dealt with the trauma or whatever that trauma may be, and I'm now at peace with it. It's not a problem for me anymore because, hey, it was no big deal in the first place. Now I've seen it this way. Is that?
I mean, those are some of the reports that you hear from people. And I think that, in fact, what happens is it's not a matter of, when people process a trauma just in a group therapy setting, for instance, it can be extraordinarily powerful, but the learning is still relatively small. Theoretically, when you're in a psychedelic state, you're jacking up that plasticity dramatically so that you can really reshape the memory in a much more fundamental way. Whereas it might take many, many iterations to really reshape the memory in more normal daily settings. But again, this is all speculation.
Yeah. So how do you measure that? Because all you've got to measure it is that person's new version of events. So all you've got to measure that by is their new memory of the situation. Yeah. Is that fair or not?
Well, I mean, to some extent, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, that people will say, well, I don't have post-traumatic stress disorder anymore. And not like the trauma went away. It's not that people forget what happened, but they're able to remember it in a way that's not painful and look at it from a different perspective. And the brain isn't producing this threat response anymore.
It's almost like, the partner cheats. That person's devastated because they've been cheated upon. And then after, because this is something that really bothers me actually. After a period of time, it's like, okay, you've been mulling this over for a long time. It's now time to move on. I'll give you a really great example. Do you know who Mo Gaudat is?
No.
So he wrote the book called Solve for Happy. He was the Google ex-CEO, and his son, Ali, got appendicitis at 21, on the operating table, died. And he was devastated, Mo. And for 6 months, he was deeply depressed, very sad, as you'd imagine he would be, lost his son. And after 6 months, he said, I can't keep crying. So he wrote a formula for happiness. Because that's what you do. You will identify.
You will identify.
He wrote a book called Solve for Happy, which became a global hit, where he dug into the formula, the almost the equation for happiness, and taught himself how to be happy again. And so, for me, it's like people go through. Let's say the breakup takes place, and at some point, people make peace with it. Now, sometimes that's spurred on by a new partner to come into their life, which they now can make peace.
Yeah.
Okay. Or it's less painful than it was before.
Yeah.
Are you saying, hypothetically, by using psychedelics, those people that go through that might be able to get to a place where they're able to make peace with something sooner? And more
anecdotally, that's what the stories say. And I think it makes sense. Again, we just don't, the scientific research on psychedelics is a little messy right now. I have actually one of my former students is involved in some of this research, and he's very critical of the methods in some of these studies. But a lot of these studies produce effects that are so large, they actually have to stop it because they feel it's unethical for the placebo group not to get this treatment. So it's really strange the way these things are working right now. And there's some stuff that suggests it's a placebo effect. But how do you do a placebo control for psychedelics, right? If you're tripping balls, it's like, it's pretty clear. And it's really hard to fake that with the sugar pill, So it's... Absolutely. So the scientific research is hard, right? But that's what the data seems to, anecdotally speaking, there's very powerful testimonials to that effect, that it can accelerate people's ability to see these things differently.
Jim Jeffries once said, about guns in America, he said, people shoot each other very quickly, and that's why he likes muskets, because it gives you time to calm down. And as you're loading the musket, you're like, well, you're not such a bad bloke in there. And it's like that time to calm down. I find that interesting. Okay, let's talk about my dad.
Okay.
Who's 80 years old.
You want to lie down on the couch?
Yeah. He says he's a realist, but he's a pessimist. And I don't believe there's any way in life you should be other than optimistic, because it doesn't serve you unless you are.
Mm-hmm.
However, it seems to me that the older you get, the easier it is to fall into cynicism and realism, as he would call it, or pessimism, than it is to stay in the world of optimism. So when you look at memories of people that are much older versus people that are much younger, you could argue that they've had enough life experience to pick out many good memories and many positive things that would have happened along the way.
Yeah.
But isn't it, to me, it's like you do 99 things right for your wife and you do one thing wrong, and she only remembers the one thing wrong. It's like my dad seems to remember all the bad bits, but doesn't remember the good bits. And that doesn't seem to serve well as we get older.
Yeah. Well, so interestingly, the research shows that on average, people become more optimistic, in fact, unrealistically positive as they get older. Of course, this isn't everybody.
Not my dad. Yeah.
So Laura Carstensen at Stanford has done a lot of research on this topic.
Okay.
So there really is an optimism bias that increases when people get older, as it turns out. But this is, again, not everybody. And one thing that you see, for instance, quite commonly in older people is they get stuck in this toxic form of nostalgia. And, America's bathing in this right now, right? But it's like they get stuck in this toxic form of nostalgia. And in fact, the term nostalgia was actually coined by a Swiss doctor as a kind of disease. So he would see this in these soldiers that would go out and they would come back actually kind of traumatized, but they had this wistful memories of their innocent time, and it really kind of made the present much more painful. And so what happens is sometimes people can look back on the past and remember a past that didn't really happen, or they remember it in this very unrealistically positive way. And they use it as evidence for why things are terrible now and why things will never be as good as they were. So it's always a process of not just what you remember, but what you take away from it. How do you frame that narrative that you're putting together that's essential, right? And so if you're viewing it from a perspective of loss, and then you're going to be very pessimistic. You have good reason to be pessimistic. But if you frame it from a perspective of growth, I can look back at all of these things, as much as I wish I had more hair, as much as I wish I didn't have high cholesterol. I don't know. Exactly. As much as all those things, I don't want to be as, dumb as I was like 30 years ago. I'm glad that I've learned many lessons and kind of learned to catch a lot of the ways that things about me that I didn't like and be able to transform in certain ways. And so I think it's really important for people to realize that memory is not objective. There are bits and details that capture what happened. But what I say is that it's like the concept of a photographic memory is utterly incorrect. No one on earth has been discovered who has a photographic memory about everything. Now, there are some interesting ways in which some people resemble that, but we can get into that later. But the important thing is memory is much more like a painting, right? So let's say I have a great example that I show in some of my talks where there's a painting that Van Gogh did of this church. And you can see this painting, and I put it side by side by the real church. And you can look at it and you could say, yeah, that's the same thing in some sense. And there's some details that are quite well preserved in the painting. But of course, if you ever see a Van Gogh painting, it's not it's not a photographic representation of what happens. There's some bits that are distorted and incorrect. And then there's some bits that just reflect the way he looks at the world that's unique to him, right? And paintings are like that, right? It's like there's some bits that are true, some bits that are objectively inaccurate, and some bits that are neither true nor false, but reflect the way the artist is looking at the world as present. And, we're all the artists of our own memories, really.
It's a nice way to say it, the artists of our own memories. What can you teach me about how I can teach myself to create better structure around my memories? I mean, I have very much, and I think I can kind of repeat stuff that I maybe shouldn't repeat. I say over and over again, I have a bad short-term memory. So I buy into that theory now. For example, my wife, actually, all our wives remember everything, and I can't remember what I did yesterday.
Yeah.
And so for me, being able to remember better, okay, and I lean into ways of learning, I think, that help me remember. If I have a conversation with you, I remember a lot. If I read something, I remember less. If I read something and you have a whiteboard and you draw me pictures about what you're talking about, it stays forever, because I can associate everything back to a picture, or not everything, but a lot of things back to a picture, but I can't in other ways. So what can I do? What skills can you teach me? What tools can I consider to help myself get to that place?
To get to this place where it's like you can remember anything that you want to memorize.
As much as possible, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So every kind of problem that you have in memory has its own best strategies and solutions. So the strategy that you use for remembering a name might not be the same as the strategy for remembering a place that, remembering your way around a new city and being able to remember how to get from the hotel to the supermarket or whatever, right? So but that said, there are some things I think that you can keep in mind. So one thing I talk about is that we often have the information in there somewhere, but we just can't find it. And so one tip I like to give people is to do what's called planting cues. So let's say if you have to remember to do something in the future, what you can do is you can take something that is going to be available in the environment as a reminder and keep that, form a memory of a future thing that you will do. Imagine doing something in the future where you see that cue and then it pulls up the memory for you. So an example I like to give, I'm not sure how good of an example it is, especially for, Middle Eastern audience,
Go for it.
is that, let's say you need to take out the trash. And so you know that you have this garden gnome sculpture in your, the little like bearded dude with like a cone hat, something like that in your garden.
Yeah.
So you can imagine yourself coming back home from work and seeing that gnome, and the gnome says, "Hey, don't go inside. You need to take out the trash." And then imagine yourself looking at that gnome and then walking to the trash can and imagine yourself taking it out. So what happens is when you go back home, you're going to see that gnome, and that gnome is going to remind you of what you need to do because the cue is right there in front of you. That reminder is there. It's kind of like people used to do this with tying a string around their finger.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like you have an alert basically that's going to tell you, hey, don't forget to take out the garbage, but you've planted it yourself, right? So you can do this with faces and go like, okay, well, there's something about, Spencer's face that I need to be able to use as a cue to be able to pull up his name. And so you're going to take something. I can't do this right now because I'm absolutely horrible with names, but if I were to figure out some kind of cue for you, I could be able to tie your appearance to your name in a certain way, right? And so tying something that is in front of you to the arbitrary thing you need to remember is very important, because a lot of our most difficult memory challenges are things that are fairly repetitive or common kinds of everyday things that we're trying to memorize, and they're arbitrary, right? So in other words, there's like remembering faces and names. Well, we see many, many faces in our lifetime, and so faces can be kind of confusable, and there's nothing that relates a face to a name. So there was once a time where the guy who was named Baker would give you bread.
And I guess the name is Lodge. I was an innkeeper. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It was Miller. Hey, where's my flour? Yeah. But nowadays, of course, it's just utterly arbitrary, right? So you have these arbitrary names that are arbitrarily paired with these faces that look like other faces you've seen. And so it's a miserable memory problem because you imagine that you walk into your closet and it's just a mess of all these clothes that are like same color and you can't find the one you're looking for, right? And that's what memory is going to be. Like if I form a memory for a name and try to put it together with that face, and I don't really have any reason to put them together, I just form this blurry memory that's just like all these other people who I've met and I can't tell them apart, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that I talk about in the book is something called error-driven learning. And what that is basically giving yourself the chance to remember and fail, and then learning from that mistake. And that is much, much more powerful than just trying to memorize it correctly, which is kind of, in some ways, it seems paradoxical that giving yourself a chance to make a mistake produces more learning than just memorizing it correctly the first time. But we've actually explored that. Yeah.
I get that. Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. I mean, in another way, it makes sense because if you're trying to be, if you're trying to rehearse for a play, you don't literally read the script until, and just act it out and hope that it's going to come to mind when you actually do it. You try to do it from memory. You mess up the lines, and then you look at the script. This is what I'm supposed to do.
I take the Silicon Valley example because that's from where you're from, that area. It's like investors want to invest in founders that have got it wrong before.
Yeah,
rather invest in people that have got it wrong before, because then I learn the lessons.
Yeah,
I don't want to go there again and cause myself that pain again.
Yeah, although they invest in a lot of companies that are overvalued and just hemorrhage money. That's another conversation. Silicon Valley's got a lot of problems. Having grown up there, it's like a bit of an anti-intellectual wasteland. But
while we bring that up in conversation, AI.
Oh, yeah. I love talking about AI.
So let's talk about, just 5 minutes before we finish, AI. Why do I now need to bother with my memory? AI can do it all for me. Why should I even take the time to bother?
It's really a fascinating question. So humans learn in a very different way from AI. And so you hear all sorts of, frankly, dumb statements about AI, like, Sam Altman, who is kind of a conflict of interest in this, whereas they're saying, like, he's an unborn child, but my child will never be as smart as AI. And it's like, you have no idea how humans actually think and work. the principle of machine learning is to take as much information as possible and find patterns in it and use it. The principle of the human brain is to take as little information as possible and do as much with it as possible. So in machine learning, you have like things like ChatGPT, these large language models or LLMs. We can take down an entire power grid with their energy consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Our brains are using less power than a light bulb. And think about that for a moment, right? And we're doing a heck of a lot with it. So, some people say, well, brains are neurons, we'll develop neuromorphic computing and blah, 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 but you're missing the point. When you look at this environment, you have this idea that you're seeing everything. But in fact, what happens is your eyes move around and you get a few little snapshots and your brain stitches that together into a sense of everything that's happening. A computer vision model literally gets every pixel of an image and reads it in. So you're taking in very little information and generating a big picture out of it. Whereas machine learning is taking a lot of information and making very few assumptions about it, trying to work with it, right?
Based on that theory, people are worried about a lot of things they shouldn't be worried about then.
I think, I do think there are some interesting things that they should be worried about. But machines learn very differently from humans. And rather than trying to make a machine that remembers like a human, human memory and human intelligence is not perfect by any means, but machines just work on different design principles. If I want to use AI, the best application is to take a mind-bogglingly amount of big data, like this, create this giant haystack and use the model to try to find a needle in it, stuff that humans just can't deal with that level of complexity. Whereas if I want to do something that's human-like, just get a human to
Yes.
And so I think that, and humans have an interesting property, which is that a lot of these models, once they tune it up and they train it up on everything, they stop and they say, this machine, before we take it out in the world, we're going to actually stop learning. And the reason is the world changes, right? So if you took all the data on the web and you just tried to learn from it over and over and over again, you're going to get changes, systematic pattern changes over time. And so what can happen is in machine learning is the way these machines learn, when it learns new information that disagrees with what it previously learned, it can display what's called catastrophic forgetting, where it loses all of the stuff that they had spent, you're training the model to do, right? And so humans, on the other hand, we're very forgetful, but we can continually learn throughout our lifetime. Somebody who's 80 can still remember some things if they have a healthy brain, even if they're not as plastic as they were when they were 20, right? So we can continually learn through our lifetime, but in AI, it's a real fundamental problem. And it's why they have to keep coming up with every time they come up with a new model, they have to retrain it again from the bottom up.
So it's like, it can learn to think like I have thought before, but it can't learn to think the way that I may think in the future.
Yeah.
That's it. And in essence, what we're talking about here.
Part of it, of course, there's also no I. There's no, when we interact with LLMs, we might feel like there's a person there, but they're just predicting the next word. There's no self.
And because we're random and irrational, because we're human beings, and we're allowed to be, it can never follow that suit. It's only picking up what's done in the past. So
and there's problems with it. We are going to remember in ways that are more biased, inaccurate. For a lot of the biases that people talk about in AI, those biases come from data, come from biased humans. Humans, as much as face recognition systems could do badly at recognizing people of color, well, they're trained on databases that are biased against people of color and people who are it's well established that humans have horrible biases in face recognition, so it's not like human intelligence is perfect. It's just different. The key that we have, one of the things that we have going for us though, is we're designed to navigate this changing world. And so, you find out that restaurants under new management, you go in and the place that you loved for 20 years, it gives you a terrible meal. You can use that to say, I'm not going back to this place. But if you've got this kind of more machine-based statistical learning method, you're going to go, "Oh, I had a bad experience, but I could still on average say everything was good," right? So, you can say, you can find out somebody who you trusted lied to you and look back at everything differently from a new perspective, as opposed to saying, well, this person lied to me once, but most of the time I think they told the truth, right? And in some sense, there's a rationality to that approach. And in some sense, it's extremely irrational in human society, right? So I think I think it's like humans are just different. Now, the thing that I worry about, though, is humans adapt in certain ways that our brains are constantly tuning ourselves up to work less, right? And so I think one of the biggest threats I see from AI is, you could see this with text messaging, right? That it's a pain in the ass to write text messages. And so human communication adapted to this by becoming much, much more sparse and degenerate, Now that ChatGPT is writing, I certainly find that ChatGPT's writing is extraordinarily bland and just devoid of any character. But if people start to read enough ChatGPT language, they're going to write and if ChatGPT, LLMs start completing people's sentences, they'll go, I started to do this when I had Gmail started to do autocompletes, and I'll write something and it would complete my sentence. And sometimes I would say, well, that's wrong. Sometimes I would say, that's exactly what I wanted to say. Great. Sometimes I'd go yeah, that's not what I wanted to say, but it's good enough. And that's where the threat is, because once you start saying it's good enough, your brain starts to change and tune itself up for doing less work. And so we end up in this kind of vortex of mediocrity where we all start writing the same. The algorithms lead us to watch the same videos and to listen to the same music, and you lose that diversity. And here's the thing. What makes you and me ultimately useful in a way that can't be replaced to AI is episodic memory. Because you have lived experiences in the real world that are only you. I have lived experiences in the world that are only me. And memory is really the wellspring of imagination. So if you have a diverse, random set of episodic memories, you really sought out strange and interesting people in college, you read news from Chinese newspapers, I don't know, whatever it is, right? You listen to, for me, I listen to Ethiopian R&B from the 1960s and things like that. And you put all of these things together, you can create something that only you could do from all of these diverse range of experiences that you had. On the other hand, if you're just hanging out with people who think like you and doing the things that are easily available, listening to music that the algorithm tells you, you're utterly replaceable by the algorithm because you can't, or by AI, because you're just producing the lowest common denominator. And I think right now, the biggest thing that people need to do to avoid being obsolete, especially in kind of the more creative aspects of functioning, is to give themselves a diversity of experiences. But that also means being uncomfortable, and learning is extraordinarily uncomfortable. And becoming comfortable with that discomfort is absolutely, and turning the discomfort into curiosity is key, I think, to human survival in the age of AI.
I could sit and talk to you all day. This is just such a fascinating conversation and one I'm thoroughly enjoying, but I'm very conscious of time. Charan, I can't thank you enough for coming to join us today on the show. It's been fascinating.
Oh, it's been a fun conversation for me, so I'm very glad I got to do it. Thanks, man.